So each night of the Vacation Bible School, we're going to cover different characters. And tonight we are looking at the life of Gideon. Now, when I was approaching this, I thought about just simply doing a standard Bible class lesson that probably you've heard at some point in your life about the story of Gideon. But I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. Tonight will be different than the other lessons. Tonight I am going to, from a first-person narrative, tell you the story of Gideon. Okay? So I'm going to be Gideon, even though I don't look anything like Gideon. I'm pretty sure Gideon wasn't redheaded. But I'm going to do my very best to portray Gideon tonight. And then at 7:40, we're going to have a special visitor. Okay? May or may not be the real Gideon. I don't know. Maybe Mike Prevost. But we're going to see that. But I want to start out, and I want to play a song that you may know this. The song is called He is Jehovah. And the words of this song go very much with the lesson that we're going to be looking at tonight in the life of Gideon. So I'm going to play this song for us. I want you to listen to these words. Come on in.
He is Jehovah, God of creation. He is Jehovah, Lord God Almighty, the balm of Gilead, the rock of ages. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. He is the great I am, the God of Abraham, Jehovah Shalom, the God of Israel, the God of Israel, the everlasting one. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah. He is Jehovah, Lord God Almighty. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. He's Jehovah, Jehovah Jireh, God of salvation, God of Messiah. The Son He sent to you, He testified of Him. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah. He is Jehovah, Lord God Almighty. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah. He is Jehovah, Lord God Almighty. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee.
I want to know, had anybody ever heard that song before? It was made famous back in the 80s by the name of Betty Jean Robinson, I believe was her name. And she had a version of the song, and then the Gaither Trio made it even more famous in the 80s. That was a cappella, Keith Lancaster and his group performing God is Jehovah. So as we do this, there will be some points where I'm going to go out of character. And some points where you'll strictly understand I'm very much in character. But let's begin, all right? Take your Bibles and turn to Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 7. Now, what I'm doing here and giving you this first-person perspective is not going to follow exactly with your scripture, but I believe that you'll be able to find just about everything that I share with you as we begin this together. All right, let's begin. Hello. My name is Gideon. I am the son of Joash, and I am of the family of the Abiezrites. I am from the tribe of Manasseh and the nation of Israel. There are those that say that I am a great warrior. Now, it is true that I have always fought against the enemies of Israel. But there was a time that I was little more than a flea on the dog's back of a nation called the Midianites. Now, the Midianites, they've been raiding our lands for several years now, and they've took what they've wished and they've killed whomever they wished. It's true that my one consolation was that I was able to pay them back in part for the pain that they had caused my people. But they were a powerful and vicious people. And many of our people fled to go hide in the mountains and the hills and even in holes in the ground. When the angel of the Lord found me, that's what I was doing. I was hiding. I was in my father's wine press, threshing wheat, hoping, just praying that the Midianites would not find me and take away what little bit of food reserve that we have left. It was there that an angel of the Lord found me. And he said to me these words. He said, "The Lord is with you, Gideon." And he continued to say, "You have been chosen by God to deliver Israel from their enemies. God be with you, and together," listen to what he said. He told me, the angel said, that you will crush the might of Midian in a single night. Oh, it went beyond my imagination, those words. Now, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever seen an angel? Have you ever seen an angel? Neither had I. But here's the situation. I had no idea who this was, but what he said and the way in which he said it, all of a sudden it spoke to my heart. And I promise you, I wanted it to be true, right? But I had no idea whether what was being said came from God or not. I was confused. So I told God that if he were really the one calling me for this task, I needed a sign. I needed something to prove. So first I wanted to make an offering to God. And I asked God, this angel, if they would stay until I returned from making this offering. And sure enough, the angel said he would. So I returned home and I took the meat of a young goat that we had in our supply and I placed it in the pot to cook. And then I took an ephah of flour and I made bread without yeast. And once the meat was cooked, I took and put it in a basket along with the bread and took the pot filled with the broth from the young goat and returned to the angel who was now standing there in that field beside me. In fact, he was standing beside an oak tree. And I offered the angel the food, but he said that I should pour the broth and then place the basket with my offering on a nearby rock. And as I stepped back, listen, as I stepped back from that offering, the angel took this staff that he had in his hand, and with the tip of that staff, he touched the meat and he touched the bread, and the rock on which it was setting became engulfed in flames that consumed the entire offering. And when I looked up from those flames, you know what? The angel had disappeared. Can you believe that? He disappeared. I had seen an angel of the Lord face to face. Now, I don't know if you think that's a big deal to you or not, but I had heard it said that no man had ever seen an angel face to face and lived to tell about it. Oh, sovereign God, I have seen your angel face to face. And you know, as soon as I was thinking that, I heard this voice that came down out of heaven, and this voice said, "Peace, peace, do not be afraid, Gideon, you will not die." And again, that angel, that voice said, "Peace, peace." Let me tell you, I'd not known peace for a very long time in my life. My life had been one issue after another. So right then and there, because of what has just happened, I built an altar unto God, and I named it Jehovah Shalom. Or you might say, the God of peace, right? But I was still troubled. I was still troubled. I was very afraid that in the course of my doubting that somehow I'd been very rude to this angel. And I don't guess you should be rude to an angel, right? I'd been very rude when the angel said, "The Lord is with you." I nearly shouted, "Who is this God that you speak of? Who is this God that our fathers taught us about for so long? Who is this God who supposedly led Israel out of the bondage of Egypt?" You know what? I hear about that, but that can't be the God you're talking about, because the God that I hear about has turned away from us and abandoned us. And I was right. And I was wrong. I was wrong because God still cared for us. But I was right that God had turned His face from us. But it wasn't God's fault. No. He had lifted up His hand of protection from over us and delivered us into the hands of our enemies, because our people were very sinful people. We had, by the way, if you didn't know the story, we had worshiped all these other gods and offered sacrifices and prayers in those other gods' name, and God was furious. Now listen, we didn't intend to anger God. Does anybody ever really intend to anger God? Because you've got to understand, in our mindset, if one God is good, a bunch of gods is even better. And so all across our land, there were altars and idols, and there were prayers, and there were sacrifices made in the name of all these pagan gods, and God, Jehovah, was not pleased. Even in my own father's field, there was an altar that the villagers offered frequently their sacrifices at, an altar to Baal. And all around this altar, there was these Asherah poles, and placed there in honor of the goddess of fertility. And God said to me, He said, "Tear down that altar and build for me a proper altar in its place." So, God told me that, but He also said, "Go and get the second bull and slaughter it and offer it to me as an altar, as a sacrifice on my altar." So then cut down the Asherah poles and use those poles, the wood from those poles, to burn the sacrifice. By the way, I did what God told me to do. But I waited until it was nighttime. Do you know why I waited until it was nighttime? Because I knew I could go out there at night and I could hide. By the way, I'm very good at hiding. Because if I did this in the daytime, they would have probably killed me. So I hid. But it did me no good. It did me no good. When the villagers woke up the next morning, they went out to that altar and they found what? They found where I had destroyed it all. The Asherah poles were gone, and the sacrifice, I had placed my own altar there, and they were furious with me, and they sought to find out who did this. Of course, it was me, and they eventually discovered it had been me. And then they fought to find me. And when they found me, I was in a hiding place because I'm very good at hiding. And they dragged me out in the open, and you know what they wanted to do to me? They wanted to kill me right then and there. But a good thing happened. My Father interceded for me. See, my father said this statement. He said, "Who is Baal that you need to defend his honor? If he is such a puny God that he needs you to avenge his insults, what kind of God is that? Let Baal contend with my son if he is the God that you say that he is." And my dad shamed every single one of those villagers who were out there to take my life. And they grumbled and they returned to their homes. But from that day forward, they gave me a brand new name. Do you know what that name was? Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend with him. I like my other name much better. It wasn't long after that, by the way, that the Midianites returned to our land to ravage our crops and steal from our homes. And they came, by the way, this time they had even more people. They had allies, the Amalekites. And with people from other eastern tribes, they settled in the valley of Jezreel. And those who dared to look down into their camp said that the Midianite forces were as numerous as a herd of locusts, and that their camels were no more than could be counted the sands upon the seashore. Those who tried to count the number of Midianites and their armies seemed to agree that there was at least 120,000 of them, and they were armed in their camp. It was then that God spoke to me once again, and he said, "Gideon, the time has come to raise up an army to drive out the enemies of Israel." And so I went to the city square and I found our ram's horn. It's the ram's horn that we use to call people to war. And I lifted it to my lips, and then I began to make the sound. You may know this as the shofar. People came running immediately from their fields and from their houses. And when they came into the village square, I told them what God had said to me. And it was that it was time for us to rise up and overthrow the shackles of the Midianites and to go to war. And we sent out the messengers to the far reaches of the tribe at Manasseh, also the tribe of Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulun. And within a few short days, all those men began to gather in our village. Ultimately, I had 32,000 32,000 encamped around my home. 32,000 men had come to my banner. 32,000 had come to be led into battle by little old me. 32,000 men. I was proud. But then I reminded myself of something. How many men did those Midianites have? 120,000. And we had how many? 32,000. And I looked up to God and I said, God, we need to talk. If you truly want to send me and these men in the battle with our enemies, by the way, we're outnumbered 4-1, God, I need a sign to prove that this is truly your will. And I had decided on the test that would surely prove if it was indeed God's will. You see, when I was younger, I would walk in to my father's wine press in the morning, and I would see the floor glistening with the dew of the night. And so I said to God, God, please don't be angry with me. But if it's your will to send us in the battle with the size of force and the certain outnumbering, allow me to put a fleece from the flocks of my father on the floor of this wine press. And if it's your will, make it so that in the morning the floor is dry, but the fleece is wet. And so I placed that fleece upon the floor, and I went to bed. Not sure if I slept very much. But when I got up the next morning, what do you think I found? That's right. The floor was completely dry, but the fleece was completely soaked. God had spoken. God was willing to call me Gideon and 32,000 to war, but still I only had how many? 32,000 men. I don't know if you know this or not, but that's hardly an army that would overwhelm the Midianites. And what if I misunderstood God? What if I set this test up and it just happened to happen, but it really wasn't God? I'm still not sure that God is really involved. So I said to God one more time, hey, God, please don't be angry. But just to make sure I haven't misunderstood your will, allow me to give you one more test. Allow me to place the fleece on the floor of the winepress one more time. And in the morning, if the fleece is dry, but the floor is wet, then I'll know. That's what I did. And then I went to bed. Not sure if I slept all that well, but the next morning I got up and guess what I saw? That's right. The fleece was dry and the floor glistened with the dew of the morning. It was then I knew this was God's will. 32,000 men. With such a God at our back, 32,000 men, it could work. It was a respectable army in the hands of God, right? I could do this. I could lead these men into victory against those battle Midianites. They outnumbered us 4-1, but it could be done, right? We were the men of Israel. God was with us. And we were going to be bold and courageous and able to stand against those pagans, and we were going to put them down, right? But then God said, Gideon, you've got too many men. Wait a second, God, did I hear you right? Seriously, God, we only have 32,000. But God said, tell the men that whoever is afraid, may go home to be with their tribes. Well, that's not so bad, right? Because these are brave men of Israel. Sure enough, if I tell them this, they're going to say, no, let's go. We're ready. We're willing and we're able. These men were of courage and strength, and certainly they would believe that they would be able to overcome any supposed fear. And if there was some that left, I would hardly miss them. And so I mockingly addressed the men. If any of them were afraid, if any of y'all are scared, y'all can just go ahead and leave. What I didn't expect was 22,000 of them folded up their tents and went to home. I only had 10,000 soldiers left. But still, I'm a pretty positive guy. This is 10,000 more soldiers at my disposal than I've ever had before. 10,000 more than I've ever led into a battle before. It could still be done. I might yet win a battle over the greatest armies of our earth, still with only 10,000 men. But then God spoke to me again. He said, Gideon, you've got too many men. God said, Gideon, if you were able to go into battle and win with such a force, then Israel might believe that they had won against Midian by the force of their own arms rather than by the power of my arm. And he told me to take the army, now get this, down to the banks of the river and observe how they drank from the river, right? Now, when we got down there, most of the men, as I would have normally suggested, got down upon their knees and they brought the water to their lips with their hands. Customary, right? That's what you would expect. But then there were these others, no more than, say, 300 guys, that laid on their stomachs and lapped the water like dogs. It was those few, get this, that God said, I was going to take into battle against the hordes of the Midianites, and the rest, I had to send them home. And suddenly, I got to tell you, I was very much afraid. Wouldn't you be? Facing thousands of armed men with only a force of 300, it was a sure way to bring defeat and shame upon me and my family and my people. The only possible outcome in my mind I could think of is I am going to die. So I was very afraid. But God knew that. So God spoke to me again. He said, Gideon, if you are afraid, and yes, I was, take your servant Purah. Take Purah with you and carefully make your way to the edge of the Midianite camp and listen to the conversation of some of the men there, and I will give you the courage that you need for the battle. And so Purah and I, we crept down very quietly. Remember, I told you I'm pretty good at hiding. Crept down the outpost of the enemy camp, and when we arrived, I overheard two men talking. One spoke to a dream that he had had. He said that he had seen this huge round loaf of barley bread roll down into the camp and crash into a tent, overturning it and causing it to collapse. And the other man, and I promise you, this is what he said. I'm not making this up. He said, this can be nothing else but the sword of Gideon. And Gideon, the son of Joash, and the nation of Israel. Their God has delivered Midian and the entire camp into his hands. And I'm thinking, you know what? How did he know my name? And he even knew the name of my father and the nation that I represented. The only way, in my mind, as I sat there, crept outside of that enemy camp, I came to one realization. The only way he would know that is if God had made it known to him. It was right then and there that I knew that God would grant us victory over our enemies. So I didn't wait until I got home. I bowed down right then and I began to worship. Quietly, Pura and I made our way back. And when we arrived, I cried out, "Get up! Get up! Get up! God has delivered Midian into our hands." And I divided our men into 3 companies and gave each 2 things: a horn to blow and an empty jar to cover their torches. And then I explained them very carefully where they should position themselves around the enemy camp. And also, I sent them to their places. And when it seemed that our men were properly positioned, once again, I blew my horn. And as one man, our army broke their jars to reveal their torches, and they blew their trumpets, and the night was lit up with the blaze of our torches, and our trumpets spoke with the judgment of God upon the camp of Midian. And all of our men shouted out loud, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." It was such an overwhelming sight and thunderous sound that the camp of the Midianites, get this, they erupted in fear. And each one of them grabbed their swords as quickly as possible, but they were confused because they believed that the enemy was in the midst of their camp. And you know what they began to do? They turned their swords on one another. Folks, the slaughter that night was terrible. And then the sounds always stick in my mind, the cries as they fled from that valley. And we chased them all the way out of our land. And the Midianites never bothered us again. That night changed me as an individual. That night altered who I am. It was on that night that I realized all that God had meant to teach me. I had learned that I was being called by a God who wanted not my allegiance to be divided among several gods and several priorities, but I was following a God who demanded my total allegiance. He was a God who would not tolerate any other God or any other treasure to stand between me and Him. If I was to be used by God in my life, I needed to destroy and remove from my life anything that could compete for my affections. But I also learned that I serve a very powerful God. He was a God who was capable of consuming an entire offering from the flames of a rock. A God who could protect me from the anger of my own neighbors when they didn't understand me. A God who could speak to me through my own personal fleeces and by the dreams of my enemies. And He was a God who could destroy a mighty army with a force of only 300 men. That is the God that I serve.
Hark, I heard you call my name. I am Gideon.
And there he is.
A man called by God. Nothing to offer except obedience to the king. Facing an army over 120,000, it looked like an impossibility. I had 32,300 men. God said it was too many. You know the story well. He said those who were afraid go home, and 22,000 left. And then God said there's still too many. You put your confidence in your numbers. Go down and drink water. Those who lap like a dog and those who kneel down and take a sip. Those who knelt down and took a sip were 300. God said, take those with you and go to battle. God gave him a plan. He asked for signs, and God gave him signs. The tragedy of the story, and I think what breaks Gideon's heart, is God's people turned back to idolatry after all God had done for them. We need to remember the faith of Gideon. Remember that when God calls, he doesn't call those who are qualified. He qualifies those whom he calls.
Thank you,
Thank you
Gideon.
for allowing me this opportunity to visit with you.
God bless you, Gideon. Godspeed. So I want you to listen one more time to the words of the song. I'm going to read them out to you. He is Jehovah, God of creation. He is Jehovah, Lord God Almighty, the balm of Gilead, the rock of ages. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. He is the great I am, the God of Abraham. Jehovah Shalom, the God of peace I am. The God of Israel, the everlasting one. He is Jehovah, the God that healeth thee. The last part of that song, the part that always sticks with me, of course, that emphasizes that we serve a God of peace. A God who could bring strength to the life and peace to the heart of someone like Gideon. And again, those words, I emphasize them one more time. He is the great I am, the God of Abraham. Jehovah Shalom. Those are not empty words. They're very powerful words because he is the God of peace and will always be the everlasting one, the God who heals us. Thank you for taking this time to look into the life of Gideon. You know, it's the first time in all of my years I've ever done anything quite like that. I'm probably embarrassed myself, but that's okay.
It was great. Very entertaining.
But anyway, I thank y'all for that. If you ever want to look up the shofar, if you're not familiar with the shofar, it is a trumpet made out of a ram's horn. And it has been used even to this day in Israel as a sign of different things, a sign of rejoicing, a sign of war, a sign of peace. And I can just imagine as Gideon goes into that village square and blows that horn for the very first time, not knowing what to expect, but knowing that this was God's leading. Had to be a pretty impressive thing to see 32,000 men show up ready for battle. But then, as the story shows us, kind of turned a little bit, didn't it? Now, there's one final lesson I want to give to you, and this is it. You know, our churches from time to time, we show up, we have a lot of people, right? Maybe we say we've got our 32,000 men. And then what happens over time? Some fall away. Some drift away. Some pack up their tents and go home. Some do it because of fear. Some do it because of other priorities. Some do it because they've got other gods in their life, right? We serve a God today that demands that same total allegiance that he demanded of Gideon and the nation of Israel. Sadly, as Gideon pointed out, there were many other times where the nation of Israel wandered away from God. And as we look through these next few nights' lessons, we're going to hear stories of others that will deal with similar issues. So I want to invite you back to be with us each night of this week as we continue our vacation.